They gave her away for 5 sacks of cornmeal and a rusted rifle. That's what Lorna heard the trader mutter in Comanche as he slapped her uncle's back and spit into the dust. Her uncle didn't look at her. He hadn't since they left Texas 2 weeks ago, not even when she coughed up blood outside Amarillo, or when she fainted from fever 3 days into the trail. He just told her to stay under her bonnet and keep quiet. "Ain't nobody gonna want you if they see that face," he'd said. But now she stood trembling in front of the Apache camp, her palms sweating against her dirt-crusted skirt, her throat dry as ash. The man who'd accepted the trade stood across from her, taller than any man she'd ever seen, bare-chested with braids like dark rivers down his back. He hadn't said a word, just nodded once. And the tribe behind him, curious but quiet, didn't come closer. Lorna kept her head down. She didn't know what they expected. She wasn't pretty, not anymore. Not since the branding. Not since Mama died. She'd stopped thinking of herself as a girl, much less a bride. She was just something to be traded. She heard a soft sound, footsteps in the dust, and looked up. The tall Apache man had stepped forward. He was close now, close enough she could smell the cedar smoke and rawhide on his skin. He didn't reach for her, didn't grab her, just stood, studying her, his dark eyes unreadable. Something in her broke. Maybe it was the silence, or the way her uncle rode off without a backward glance, or maybe she was just tired of pretending she wasn't broken inside. She reached up, slowly, hands trembling, and untied the bonnet from beneath her chin. It fell back, revealing the jagged scar that ran from her right temple down to her jaw, the reminder of what men did when women said no. Her hair, thin and tangled, clung to her cheeks. Her voice cracked. "I know I'm not pretty," she whispered. "You don't have to pretend." The man didn't flinch, didn't move. But then slowly he stepped around her, behind her. She tensed. But all he did was lift her hair, as gently as if it were spun glass. She froze. His fingers, calloused but steady, began working her hair into 3 sections. He didn't speak, didn't rush. He braided, not like a servant, not like a man who owned her, but like a priest weaving a ritual, like she was sacred. The air around them seemed to still. The tribe watched. The wind died. When he finished, he tied the end with a thin strip of leather and stepped in front of her again, still silent, still watching. But something in his eyes had shifted. Not pity, not lust, something older, something solemn. Lorna's knees nearly gave out, not because she was afraid, but because, for the first time in her life, someone had looked at her like she wasn't ruined, like she was becoming. She lowered her eyes and whispered, "What's your name?" The man didn't speak, but a gray-haired woman behind him answered in soft Apache. "Nashkota," she said. "It means he speaks only when the spirit calls." Lorna looked up again. Nashkota nodded once, slow and deep. And though no words had passed between them, she understood. She hadn't been bought. She'd been chosen. They didn't put her in a cage or tie her to a stake, like the stories back home warned. Instead, the old woman who had spoken Nashkota's name took Lorna's hand and led her toward a smaller lodge near the edge of the encampment. The sun was low, casting long gold shadows over the ground, and the silence around them felt heavy. Not cruel, just waiting. Children peeked out from behind woven walls, their eyes curious. A man sharpening arrows paused mid-stroke. A younger girl with painted cheeks whispered something Lorna couldn't understand, and a ripple of giggles passed behind her. Lorna's legs felt unsteady beneath her, the braid still warm against her back. It was strange how much that simple act clung to her skin, like it had altered the very air she breathed. She kept her head down, still unsure whether she belonged here or was simply being kept until some unspoken debt was fulfilled. Inside the lodge, the woman gestured for her to sit. Then, without a word, she brought a basin of water warmed by the fire and began cleaning Lorna's hands. Not roughly, not quickly, just steady, like she'd done this before. Lorna watched, stunned. She hadn't been touched this gently since her mother died. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice smaller than she meant it to be. The woman glanced at her, then tapped her own chest and said, "Shuya." Lorna pointed to herself, hesitated, then mumbled, "Lorna." Shuya smiled and patted her shoulder. Then she reached behind the fire pit and brought out a folded cloth, dark red, patterned with threadwork, and laid it in Lorna's lap. "Where?" she said, slow but clear. "Tonight." Lorna shook her head, confused. "What happens tonight?" But Shuya was already at the door, lifting the flap, calling out something in Apache. A moment later, Nashkota appeared. He stood in the opening, shadows slicing across his chest, his gaze locked on Lorna like she was the only thing holding the wind back. He didn't enter, just waited. Lorna looked at the cloth in her lap, then up at him. Her heart pounded. "Am I being presented?" she whispered. She'd heard of such things. Traded women shown like livestock, judged by elders, sometimes rejected. She swallowed hard. "I can't. Please, I'm not." But Nashkota stepped forward at last. Not with force, not with demands. He reached down and tapped the braid he'd made, then placed his palm lightly over her heart. Then, wordless, he stepped back. Lorna couldn't breathe. That gesture, so simple, said more than any language could carry. She stood slowly, clutching the cloth. Shuya helped drape it over her shoulders. Together they stepped out into the camp. A semicircle of elders had gathered around a fire that glowed like low embers, faces calm and unreadable. Lorna tried to shrink back, but Nashkota stood beside her now, close enough she could feel the heat from his skin. One of the elders, a thin man with hawk feather earrings, stepped forward. He looked at Lorna, then at Nashkota, and then said a single word. The entire circle repeated it in unison. Shuya leaned over and translated softly into her ear. "They say, accepted." Lorna's throat tightened. Her hands gripped the edge of the cloth. She didn't know the customs, didn't know what was expected, but she knew what she'd just felt. Not purchased, not pitied, accepted. And as Nashkota turned his gaze back to her, calm and endless like canyon stone, she realized something terrifying and beautiful. He had never once looked at her like she needed to be different. That night, the stars blinked cold above the ridgeline as Lorna sat outside the lodge, legs tucked beneath her, the ceremonial cloth still wrapped around her shoulders. No one had ordered her to stay put, and yet something in her spine told her to remain still. Not out of fear, but reverence. The fire crackled softly nearby, sending up slow ribbons of smoke. Shuya sat beside her, grinding dried roots with a stone pestle, humming low in her throat. Now and then, children tiptoed past, trying not to stare. Lorna's skin prickled with awareness, but she didn't flinch. Something about the braid still resting down her back made her feel anchored. She caught movement from the corner of her eye. Nashkota, alone, walking slowly toward the fire. His stride was calm, measured, but deliberate, like he carried meaning in every step. He wore a fur-lined vest now, his hair loose but tied back at the nape, and his eyes didn't move from hers even once. He sat opposite the fire, across from her, and began to place stones around the outer flame. 1, 2, 3, each with purpose, each with silence. Then, with a slow exhale, He began painting lines in the dirt between them using a sharpened stick. Lorna watched, puzzled. They formed no pattern she recognized, just arcs and curves and anchors drawn into the earth like a language of ghosts. Shuya leaned over and whispered, "He honors the moment." "What moment?" Lorna murmured. "You," Shuya said simply. "You sat by the fire." Lorna blinked. "That's all?" "In our way, sitting beside flame with the one who chose you." "It is a prayer," Shuya added. "You accept the warmth and the burden." Lorna's heart clenched. No one had ever used the word chose for her, not even in jest. Nashkota finished his design, then looked up. His hand hovered over the marks in the soil, then tapped one carefully. Shuya interpreted, voice low. "He says the old path is ending." Another mark. "The girl is not ash." Then another. "The scar is not her shame, but her warning." Lorna didn't know if the tears came because of the beauty, the shock, or simply the feeling of being seen. She reached up to touch the braid gently, and Nashkota's eyes followed the motion. Finally, with infinite calm, he picked up a nearby pouch and tossed it across the fire to her. It landed softly in her lap. Inside, wrapped in soft cloth, was a comb. Carved from bone, smoothed with oil, shaped like a river's curve. On its edge was a single symbol etched deep. She turned to Shuya. "What does it mean?" "Becoming." Lorna held it close, her fingers trembling. The last time someone had handed her something, it was a marriage contract she hadn't signed. This was not obligation. This was invitation. Nashkota stood. So did she. He didn't speak, didn't even move toward her, but somehow his presence said enough. Then he lifted his hand, palm out, and for the first time since she arrived, gave a single word. "Tomorrow." Shuya smiled. "He will show you where the water sings." Lorna felt her breath catch, not because of where they were going, but because she'd never realized how thirsty she'd been for gentleness, for something sacred, for tomorrow. The next morning, before the sun crested the red hills, Shuya pressed a small bundle into Lorna's hands, dried meat, a soft cloth, and the carved bone comb. She didn't explain, didn't need to. Nashkota was waiting by the edge of the trees, his horse already saddled. He had brought another for her, smaller, gentle-eyed. He nodded once, then helped her mount without touching her more than necessary. Still, Lorna felt the heat of his hands even after they withdrew. They rode in silence, the forest slowly swallowing the village behind them. Sunlight filtered through pine branches in thin golden lines, and the wind smelled of stone and sage. Lorna kept one hand on the comb in her lap. It grounded her more than the saddle. Every few minutes, Nashkota would glance over his shoulder to make sure she was still following. But he didn't speak. She found comfort in that. No man had ever given her space to breathe. It took over an hour before the sound reached her ears, faint at first, then louder. Not just the babble of water, but something different, melodic, rhythmic, as if the land itself was humming. They reached a break in the trees, and suddenly the canyon opened before her. A wide pool shimmered at the base of a narrow waterfall that slipped down smooth rocks like strands of silver hair. The sound was music, pure and unbroken, echoing between red walls. Lorna gasped. She couldn't help it. "It sings," she whispered. Nashkota dismounted, tied his horse to a tree, then turned to her and extended his hand. Not to help her down, but just open, waiting. She took it. Her feet hit the ground, soft with pine needles, and they walked together toward the water. When they reached the edge, he knelt, not to drink, but to dip his fingers and touch the earth. Then he pressed the wet fingertips to his chest. Lorna watched, spellbound. He did it again, this time pressing his fingers to her chest, just above her heart. Then he pointed to the falls. She understood. This place was sacred. She stood there in silence, unsure what to do next, when he motioned for her to sit. He moved behind her, gently pulled the comb from her lap, and began unraveling the braid he had made 2 days ago. Lorna stiffened at first, but then let herself sink into the rhythm of his fingers. He combed through each tangled strand with reverence, never tugging, never rushing. It wasn't like grooming, it was like storytelling, each pull a line, each stroke a truth. She closed her eyes. When the last knot was gone, he began braiding again, different this time. Not the tight warrior braid, but something looser, flowing. She could hear his breath, slow and steady. When he finished, he slid something into her hair, a feather. Then he stepped away. Lorna turned, her heart full and unsteady, and saw him kneeling in the sand, not looking at her, just listening to the water. She whispered, "Why me?" Not expecting an answer. But after a long silence, his voice came, low and hoarse. "Because you didn't cry when they traded you." She froze. It was the first time she had heard his voice. He looked up then, and for the first time, she didn't see just a man or a warrior. She saw someone who had been waiting, for this moment, for her, for silence to finally be worth breaking. She touched the feather gently. "You heard me," she whispered. He nodded once, and the water kept singing. They returned to the village as dusk painted the sky in strokes of amber and wine. Lorna's new braid swayed lightly against her back, the feather shifting with every step like a second heartbeat. No one spoke as they passed through the rows of lodges, but heads turned. Children stopped mid-play. Shuya watched from a fire circle and gave a single, knowing nod. Something had changed, not in how they saw her, but in how she carried herself. That night Lorna couldn't sleep. The silence was no longer frightening. It was full of questions, of memories, of what Nashkota's voice had sounded like when he chose to break it for her. Because you didn't cry when they traded you. She hadn't cried because she didn't believe she was worth mourning. And yet here, in this place of stone and ritual, she was being treated as if she were made of something precious. She stepped outside the lodge and walked barefoot across the cool earth, the feather in her hair fluttering in the night breeze. The fire circle near the center of camp still burned, quiet and low. She sat beside it, hugging her knees, not surprised when she sensed someone approach. Nashkota sat beside her, not speaking, just matching her stillness. After a long while, she said, "I used to sit by a fire like this when I was small. Mama would sing while Papa cleaned his rifle. My brother would toss pebbles and pretend they were bullets. We were poor, but it felt safe." Her voice cracked. Then came the sickness and the debts. Nashkota didn't look at her, but she felt the air shift. "I was sold twice," she said softly. "Once to a trader who thought he was buying a wife. Once to a man who didn't care what he was buying." Her fingers dug into the dirt. "The scar came after I said no." Nashkota turned to her then. Slowly, deliberately, he reached into the small satchel at his side and pulled out something wrapped in deerskin. He opened it and revealed a long, thin pipe carved with symbols. He touched the end of it and said a word she didn't understand. Shuya's voice echoed in memory. "He speaks only when the spirit calls." He gestured to the pipe, then to her. She hesitated. "You want me to hold it?" He nodded. She took it gently. It felt warm, though it hadn't been near the flame. Nashkota drew a line in the dirt with a stick. 2 arcs, one tall, one small, curved inward like a crescent moon facing its twin. He pointed to one, then to her, then to the other, then to himself. She stared. That means we face each other? He didn't move, but his silence rang with approval. She set the pipe gently in the curve between the arcs, bridging the symbols. Nashkota took a slow breath. Before this fire, he said, I am not a warrior. I am not a man who takes. Lorna's eyes filled. Then what are you? His eyes met hers across the flame. A man who waits. The world stilled. She wanted to reach out, to touch his hand, to ask if the waiting was over. But she didn't. Instead, she whispered, Then I'll sit here with you, until you're ready to stop. He nodded once, and they stayed by the flame, two quiet souls who had spent their lives burning alone, now warming at last, side by side. By mid-morning, the camp stirred with the rhythm of daily life. Children chased each other through the tall grass, elders tended slow-boiling stews, and women sorted herbs and roots in quiet circles. Lorna was helping Shuya rinse linen in the river, when a sharp whistle pierced the air. Low, controlled, but urgent. Everyone froze. Then movement. Warriors emerged from between the lodges, not running, but stepping into formation like a current beneath the surface. Nashkota was among them, calm but alert, his hand resting near the knife at his waist. Shuya pulled Lorna gently to her feet and whispered, Stay behind me. Within minutes, a small group of riders appeared at the edge of the camp. Two traders, dusty and half-drunk, led a lean wagon, and behind them walked a man Lorna recognized instantly, though her body wished it didn't. His name was Boone Holloway, a rancher, a gambler, and the man who had once tried to brand her as his property. Her legs turned to ash. He hadn't changed. Same rotted teeth, same smug posture, same cruel blue eyes, scanning like a butcher weighing meat. Then his gaze landed on her, and his face split into a grin. Well, I'll be, he drawled. I figured I might find my runaway bride here. Nashkota didn't move, but the space around him seemed to shrink, like the very dust had gone still in warning. Shuya's hand gripped Lorna's tightly. Boone raised his palms in mock surrender. Easy now, I'm not here for trouble, just here for what's mine. He jerked a thumb toward her. Took this girl fair and square in Lubbock. Paid good whiskey for her, too. She ran. I aim to take her back. A murmur ran through the Apache circle, low, indignant. Nashkota stepped forward, slow and controlled. He didn't speak, only looked at Lorna. Something passed between them, an invitation, not a question. Lorna's heart pounded. The feather in her braid tickled her cheek as the wind stirred. She stepped forward, not behind Nashkota, beside him. He's lying, she said, voice loud enough to carry. He never married me. He bought me, branded me, called it discipline. She pulled the edge of her sleeve down, exposing the edge of the old burn on her shoulder. Boone's smirk faltered. Now, she's a runaway, he snapped. Don't matter what she says, she's property. Nashkota moved then, just one step. But it was enough to make every rider flinch. Boone reached toward his belt, but a spear dropped beside him before his fingers could find the grip, thrown from a boy no older than 13. Not a threat, a warning. Lorna turned to Nashkota. Let me speak. He nodded. She faced Boone. You branded me, she said. You silenced me, and I wore that shame under a bonnet for years. She reached back, touched the braid. But this man, he braided my hair like it was holy. He made no claim. He asked nothing, and he broke silence for me. Boone spat in the dirt. You think that makes you his wife? Lorna smiled for the first time. No, she said. That makes me someone no man can buy. Nashkota stepped forward at last, raised one hand. Then, slow and clear, he spoke just 2 words. "She stays." Boone took one look at the spears lining the ridge, the fire in Lorna's eyes, the stillness in Nashkota's stance, and turned his horse around. No deal, no protest, just dust kicked into silence. And as the village exhaled, Lorna felt something shift inside her chest. She hadn't been defended. She had stood. And this time, someone had stood beside her. That night, no one celebrated, but everyone watched her differently. Not like a guest, not like a curiosity, but like a woman who had passed through fire and carried no ashes. The air felt thicker, quieter. Lorna sat alone by the fire circle, the bone comb resting in her lap, the feather still nestled in her braid. It was the first time since arriving that Nashkota hadn't come to sit beside her. Part of her understood, his silence, his restraint. But part of her missed the sound of his breath, nearby. Shuya brought her a bowl of stew but didn't press her with questions. Instead, she only placed a soft blanket around her shoulders and said, "Comb remembers hand?" Lorna looked up, confused. "What does that mean?" Shuya tapped the bone comb in Lorna's lap. "When a man carves something for a woman, it keeps the memory of how he sees her." Lorna stared at the comb. Its grooves, its curve, the symbol for becoming. It hadn't meant much at first, but now, with everything she had faced, it felt heavier, more intimate than any vow. That night, she couldn't sleep. Her body was exhausted, but her mind paced like a caged horse. She rose quietly, slipped out of the lodge, and followed the curve of the river upstream until she reached the same pool where the water sang. The moon hung low and wide above the canyon, spilling silver light across the surface. She knelt beside it, touched the cool water, and stared at her reflection. The scar was still there, the thin line running from temple to jaw, cutting through memory. But now there was something else. The braid, the feather, the glint of bone in her hand. She didn't look erased. She looked claimed, but not by him, by herself. She breathed in the canyon air and whispered, "I'm still me, and I'm still here." Behind her she heard a soft sound, leather against stone. She turned slowly. Nashkota stood at the tree line, watching, unmoving. For a long moment neither of them spoke. Then she said, "Why didn't you sit with me tonight?" He stepped closer, eyes dark and unreadable. "Because I needed to see if you would sit alone." His voice was quiet, but it carried. "You did." Lorna rose to her feet, holding the comb tightly. "And if I hadn't? Then I would have sat first." She smiled, not because it was sweet, but because it was true. He stepped forward again, now just a breath away, and held out his hand. Not to take the comb, but to offer his own. He opened his palm, revealing a new carving, rougher, less finished, but unmistakable. A small wooden feather, the same shape as the one in her braid. "I carved it tonight," he said. "Not for you, for me, to remember the woman who stood when no one else would." She reached out slowly, took it from him. Their fingers brushed, and the moment held. "You don't need to braid my hair again," she whispered. "I know what I am now." Nashkota's eyes softened. "Then braid mine," he said, her breath caught. She hadn't expected that. Not a gesture of ownership, but surrender. Trust. She stepped behind him, took his long, dark hair in her fingers, and worked silently. Not like a ritual, like a promise. The comb in her pocket, the feather at her crown, and the memory of standing at the edge of the world with a man who knew when to be still, and when to ask her to move first. The next morning brought wind and smoke A nearby prairie fire had been spotted on the southern ridge, moving faster than expected. Lorna woke to the sound of shouted words in Apache, the thundering of hooves, the smell of ash carried on the breeze. Shuya was already outside, her arms full of blankets, calling for the younger children to be gathered in the central lodge. Nashkota strode past with two others, eyes sharp, jaw tense. Lorna ran toward him without thinking. "What can I do?" she asked, breathless. He didn't hesitate. "Help Shuya," he said. "Protect the little ones." But then he turned back and pressed something into her hand. The bone comb. "If fire comes," he said quietly, "this is what you carry." She nodded, heart hammering. She understood. It wasn't just a comb. It was everything they'd built in silence. Hours passed in a blur of tension. Lorna helped douse the lodge walls with water, packed satchels with herbs and cornmeal, soothed crying children while Shuya sang in a low, steady tone. Smoke thickened in the air. The hills beyond the far trees were now red with flickering heat. And still, Nashkota hadn't returned. Dusk fell. The fire was closer. Some of the men had returned, but not all. Shuya's hands trembled as she knelt beside the fire circle, muttering prayers. Lorna stood outside the lodge, eyes fixed on the trail, the comb clutched so tightly in her fist it left marks. Then hoofbeats. Riders. 4, one sagging in the saddle. Lorna ran forward just as Nashkota slid from his horse, coughing hard, his chest streaked with soot. But he was upright. Alive. She reached for him, but stopped short, still unsure what was allowed, what was right. He stepped closer and placed his forehead against hers without a word. And the world vanished. Around them the tribe moved in a rhythm of recovery, smoke still heavy, but the worst had passed. That night, as the sky cleared and stars blinked overhead, Shuya lit a sacred bundle of cedar and sweetgrass and motioned for Lorna to join her in the circle. Nashkota stood nearby, arms crossed. The elders were gathered once more. Lorna felt her heart lurch. Was this another test? A judgment? Shuya took the comb from Lorna's hand and held it up in the firelight. Then she spoke in Apache, voice strong, rhythm even. When she finished, Nashkota stepped forward and spoke only one sentence. Lorna looked to Shuya, who whispered the translation. "He says you didn't run." An elder rose, a woman with eyes like stone and smoke. She approached Lorna and reached out, not to test, not to threaten, but to tuck the feather in her braid more tightly. Then she turned and said something firm, final. The circle echoed it. Shuya leaned in and smiled. "They say, you are not ash, you are fire that stayed." Lorna's breath hitched, her knees buckled, but she didn't fall. Nashkota stepped forward, catching her just enough to steady. "Not hold, just remind her. You're strong now, and I'm here if you need me." She looked up at him, voice raw. "When will I be finished? Proving myself?" He brushed a smudge of ash from her cheek. "You already did," he said. "Now it's time to live." And for the first time since she'd been traded like nothing, Lorna smiled without fear. The fire was gone by morning, but its memory lingered in the air, like breath held too long. Ash coated the leaves, the lodges, even the river rocks. But the people moved calmly, rebuilding as if destruction was just another season. Lorna woke early, sore from work and worry, but her spirit felt oddly steady. There was something grounding about survival, about still being here. Shuya handed her a bowl of honey-root tea and gestured toward the rise beyond the camp. "He waits," she said with a sly smile. "Always there when thoughts are heavy." Lorna didn't ask who he was. She already knew. She made the climb slowly, barefoot, comb tucked into her waistband like a talisman. At the top, Nashkota stood with his back to her, arms folded as he looked out over the valley below. Smoke still lingered on the far horizon, but here the breeze was clean. He turned only when she stepped close enough to touch the earth beside him. "They said your lodge was untouched," she said softly. "The fire curved away?" "It remembered," he said simply. "The land knows who listens." She nodded, unsure what to say. After a beat, he motioned to a small cedar post beside a sapling. A single cord had been tied to it. He handed her a thin leather strap. "What's this?" she asked. "A place to hang the comb," he said. "If you choose to stay." Lorna stared at the post, then at him. "You mean this would be my lodge?" Nashkota didn't answer directly. "I carved the cord loop last winter. Didn't know who for." Her heart thudded once, deep and strange. "And if I said no?" He looked at her then, full in the eyes. "Then it waits, as long as it takes." She stepped closer, reached into her waistband, and pulled out the comb. It was worn smooth now from her hands. She looked at it, then at the post, then back at him. "Will you ever ask me to belong to you?" she whispered. "No," he said, "but I will ask to belong to you." The wind stopped. Even the trees seemed to listen. She moved to the post, slipped the comb through the strap, let it hang, and something in her chest finally loosened. "Then let it begin," she said. Nashkota's shoulders softened. He stepped beside her and pressed something small into her palm, a bead carved from bone, marked with the same symbol as the comb. Becoming. "We live beside flame," he said, "but we build with ash." She smiled. "Then we have plenty to build with." He laughed, quiet and rare. The sound startled her in the best way. That night, back in the camp, the tribe gathered not to celebrate, but to simply exist together. A pot of stew passed from hand to hand. Laughter sparked like flint. Children chased each other with feathers tied to sticks. Lorna sat beside Nashkota, not needing to touch him to feel tethered. Shuya brought her a length of fabric dyed deep rust red. "For your first winter," she said, "may the cold find no space in your bones." Lorna took it reverently. Later, as the moon rose, she returned to the post on the ridge. The comb swung gently in the night breeze. She touched it once, then placed the new bead beside it on the cord. Becoming. Not wife, not property, not trade. Just a woman with a name, a voice, and finally, a place to be heard. A week passed, and though the camp slowly returned to its rhythms, something inside Lorna had shifted. Not just the weight in her chest or the way people looked at her, though that too had changed, but the way her own footsteps felt, as if the ground no longer braced against her, but welcomed her. She had stopped flinching when a voice rose too quickly. She had stopped apologizing for being seen. And now, as she helped Shuya gather herbs near the water's edge, she heard a sound that made her stop. Humming. Soft, low, and familiar. It wasn't Shuya. It wasn't Nashkota. It was her. She was humming. The sound startled her so much she laughed, really laughed, for the first time in months. Shuya looked over and smiled. "You hear it now," the older woman said. "What?" "The song beneath your feet." Lorna tilted her head. "You mean the river?" "No," Shuya said, pointing to the ground. "The one that comes when you know you're not walking alone anymore." That evening, Nashkota approached as she knelt near the lodge fire, weaving soft grass with the younger girls. He waited, as he always did, until she acknowledged him with a glance. Then he sat, placed a new comb, this one carved from cedar, on her knee. "It's for teaching," he said. She picked it up, studied the lines. "You want me to teach them?" "Who else?" he asked. "You know both worlds." She looked across the fire at the girls, two of whom were watching with wide, quiet eyes. "I don't know where to begin." "Start with a braid," he said. "It's how we began too." She reached out, gently separating strands of one girl's dark hair. "Do you know why we braid 3 parts?" she asked. The girl shook her head. "Because sometimes," Lorna said, "a story has to hold past, present, and what we're still becoming." Nashkota's eyes warmed. She saw it, just a flicker, but it felt like the fire itself breathed in agreement. Later, under a sky thick with stars, Lorna walked to the post on the ridge again. The comb still hung there, and now the bead beside it had company, a thin piece of polished shell someone had tied in her absence. She smiled. Gifts, it seemed, didn't always come with witnesses. Just truths. As she turned to leave, Nashkota stood waiting in the path. "I dreamed once," he said, "that a woman would come with fire in her hair and water in her eyes." Lorna looked up. "And? She would not be pretty," he added, "but she would make the world beautiful." Her breath caught. "That's how you saw me?" "That's how you see yourself now," he said. "I only waited for you to arrive." She stepped forward, placed her palm against his chest. "Then don't wait anymore." He pulled her close, not with hunger, but with awe. And together they stood where the land had first sung for them, where ash had not consumed, and where a woman who had once whispered, "I'm not pretty," now braided stories into the lives of those who came after. Not as a wife, not as a prize, but as a fire that stayed, and sang, and taught others how to listen. It was Shuya who found it first, caught in the reeds where the shallows curved past the canyon's edge. A bonnet, sun-bleached and threadbare, drifting in silence like a ghost with no name. She plucked it gently from the water, held it up, and called for Lorna. When Lorna saw it, something inside her paused. She took it slowly, feeling the wet cotton between her fingers. It was the same one. Her old bonnet, the one she'd worn when she arrived, the one she'd used to hide the scar, to shrink her voice, to disappear. Shuya said nothing. She only nodded and returned to her basket of herbs, as if understanding that some things had to be faced alone. Lorna sat by the river, bonnet in her lap, fingers tracing its frayed edges. It smelled of smoke, wind, and something older. Her own fear, maybe. She remembered the day she'd first taken it off. The dust on her shoes, the silence around her, the way Nashkota had touched her hair like it held scripture, and how even then she hadn't truly let go of this bonnet. She'd buried it, perhaps, left it at the bottom of a bundle or under folded cloth. But here it was again, the last tether. Nashkota appeared at her side, so quietly she didn't notice until he knelt beside her. His eyes were on the bonnet. She didn't look at him. "I used to think this made me safe," she said, "but I was only hiding." He reached out, not to take it, but to place his hand beneath hers, cradling both her fingers and the bonnet. "Do you need it now?" he asked. "No," she said, "but I think I need to say goodbye." He nodded once, then stepped back, letting her decide the rest. Lorna stood slowly, walked to the edge of the water, and held the bonnet one last time against her chest. She whispered something. No words, just a breath shaped by memory. Then she knelt and pressed the bonnet under the water. Not with anger. Not to drown it, but to let it go. The fabric floated for a moment, then slipped downstream, carried off like a prayer already answered. Behind her, Shuya sang a soft, mourning song. Not for death, but for the leaving of something old. Lorna turned and found Nashkota watching her with eyes that held no claim, no expectation. Only witness. That night, a space was cleared in Shuya's lodge, a new woven mat placed beside the fire. A bowl carved with Lorna's own mark, the three-braid symbol she had etched herself with a flint knife. And above it, hanging from a cedar peg, was the comb. Not as a relic, as a tool for teaching, for tending, for remembering. A few of the young girls gathered at her side that evening, asking how to twist grass into rope, how to oil hair with yucca root, how to make the braid hold through wind. She showed them, gently, then asked each girl to name something they feared and to speak it aloud before starting their braid. One said snakes, another said being forgotten. The smallest whispered, being alone. Lorna tied off her braid and looked the girl in the eyes. Then you start by making one strand strong. Then you find another, then one more, and you weave them together. That's how no one stays alone. As the fire crackled and stars opened above them, Lorna knew what would come next. The scar would remain. So would the feather. But the bonnet was gone. And in its place, there was only breath and song and the sound of girls learning to braid strength into themselves. They didn't leave at dawn. They left when the girl took Lorna's hand without being asked. There was no ceremony, no goodbye feast. Only quiet nods from the elders, small bundles pressed into her arms, smoked meat, polished stones, sage tucked into cloth. The little ones hugged her waist as Nashkota secured the horses. Shuya kissed her cheek and whispered, "You came as one. You leave as many." Lorna didn't speak. Her throat had been tight since the night before. This time it wasn't fear. It was awe, gratitude too large for words. She walked beside Nashkota as they passed the comb post one last time. The cedar string still held her first bone comb, her bead, the polished shell someone had tied without a name. She didn't take it. She let it hang there, like a footprint no wind could erase. As they rode, the canyon narrowed, then opened again into golden plains. The wind lifted the feather in her hair. She didn't flinch, didn't reach for it, let it dance. At a shaded grove near a split in the river, they stopped. Nashkota dismounted first, then reached to help her down, but this time she didn't need it. She slid from the saddle and landed steady. A little girl stepped out from behind him. Same girl who braided flowers into Lorna's sleeves each evening. She carried a thin bundle in her arms, soft grass and river cloth, and something wrapped tight at the center. "What's this?" Lorna asked, kneeling. The child held it out. Lorna opened the bundle and found a comb. New, small, carved not by Nashkota this time, but by the girl. It was imperfect, uneven, beautiful. "She wants you to give it to the next girl who comes with nothing," Nashkota said. Lorna looked at the child. "How will I know her?" The child pointed to Lorna's heart. "She will stand the same way." Lorna pressed her forehead gently to the girl's and tucked the gift into her own pack. When they reached the edge of a trading road, Lorna stopped. Nashkota turned, sensing her hesitation. "We don't have to go back," he said. "We can stay in the canyon, or farther. Anywhere." She shook her head. "I want to go forward, but I needed to feel the dust under my boots again, to know I'm not running anymore." He understood. That was his gift. He always understood. "Then we go," he said. "But we carry no silence between us." They walked side by side for hours, passing ranch fences, stream beds, abandoned stage paths. Now and then, a rider passed. None looked twice, just another man and woman on the road. But they were not just another anything. When they reached a ridge above a small cabin once owned by Lorna's mother, she stopped again. The porch was overgrown, the windows dusted with old memory, but it stood, whole. "This is where I last braided someone else's hair," she said, "before the world taught me to hide mine." Nashkota's hand found hers. "Then let this be where you do it again." Days later, when the first snow came, Lorna hung a strip of river cloth by the door, not to block the wind, but to signal something to anyone passing by. This is a place where women are not bought. This is a place where braids are not bound by shame. This is a place where fire stays and teaches others to warm. And when the wind passed through it, it didn't tear. It danced, because the thread had never broken. Only waited. Just like her. Just like him. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Stories Left Behind. If a woman removed her bonnet and said, "I'm not pretty," would you have braided her hair too? Tell us in the comments.